Hello, I'm Greg with Brownell Wrights. Today we've got the first piece of our member exclusive content. So we're going to be talking about laser rangefinder error and its effect on practical accuracy. I'm sure most of you have a laser rangefinder of some kind. If you're into the long range shooting discipline, it's a pretty important thing to get the actual range to your target. What many of you probably don't know is just how much error exists in the range that your rangefinder is kicking back and how that can be negatively affecting your ability to impact the target precisely. So we're going to dive into a couple of different rangefinders. We're going to use some a very popular, what I would say to be one of the most popular rangefinders that exists, and we're going to compare that to what would be referred to as the certainly the most expensive, but probably the best rangefinder that is commercially available in a handheld unit. The thing that we're going to focus on is the error that an incorrect range can produce in our firing solution. Those of you that have engaged targets at distance, most likely you also have a little phone app or some sort of a Kestrel device that will compute a firing solution for you based on environmental readings and a computational model that allows us to predict the bullet's flight. So we're going to demonstrate the kind of error that can be present on even a fairly large size target at not altogether that far away of a distance, and show you what kind of error a practical firing solution will have if you are working with incorrect distances. Vortex Fury HD 5000, and you can see I've got to be just perfect on this thing in order for it to read out the correct range. There we go. Oh, there again we hit a 644. 642, like, you wouldn't think that you'd get that kind of error. Now, if I didn't know the range to that target, how could I know what range was correct? You're looking here through a Vectronics Vector 23. And you can see this pinging the target there at 604 yards. And it'll do that with absolute repeatability no matter how many times I take this range, and that is the verified range to that target. Now the real pickle here is, how do you know? How do you know which rangefinder? How do you know if your rangefinder is actually telling you the truth? If you're in a hunting situation, you can't exactly walk it off and step it off on your way to the animal that you're trying to engage. If your rangefinder's reading back a number, you have to trust that number. Well, how do you gain that trust? How do you know what its capabilities are? This requires you to spend quite a bit of time with your particular rangefinder, and targets of various sizes and targets of various makeups. Obviously, a furry animal is going to behave a little differently in your rangefinder than a static piece of steel. Steel is very reflective and will read back much more consistently in most cases than a furry animal. Your rangefinder is the deciding factor that determines what distance you're going to put in your ballistic computer to begin computing a firing solution. If that distance is not correct, it can produce some massive error. Now, in these two videos that you just watched, I compared the capabilities of a Vortex Fury HD 5000 AB. Now, this is what I would consider to be one of the greatest values and most popular range-finding units out there. Now, as you saw on the display, it also computes a firing solution. So this thing is a standalone ballistic calculator. Basically, you point and click this thing at your target, and it'll read out your come-ups and your windage. So very cool little unit, very, very awesome for the money. However, we compared it to a Vectronics Vector 23, okay? Now, this is what I would consider to be one of the most capable, if not the most capable, handheld rangefinders on the planet. Now, we've got a pretty ridiculous disparity of cost here. This little guy is only $1,500 street value, right? You can buy them for $1,600. This guy over here is $25,000. So there's a pretty huge disparity of cost between these two. But there's also a pretty huge disparity of capability, because if you didn't have this, you wouldn't know exactly for sure if this is giving you the right range or not. So without some way to know, you can have a tremendous amount of error creep into your firing solution. So if you look at the differences between these two units that I've demonstrated, there is like a 40-some plus yard disparity, right? Because on the one hand, the one rangefinder was reading behind the target, and the other rangefinder was hitting it exactly every single time. The beam divergence is one of the primary factors in these rangefinders that decides that it's a defining element of how accurately they can read out a range. If the beam divergence is too large and your target too small, then it's going to have a tendency to grab the background rather than the target itself. It won't differentiate between the target and the background. Where if you have a narrow beam divergence, then your aiming point is really small and defined, and you can have a little bit more success. I'm not sure what the beam divergence is on the Vortex. I'd have to look that up. But most commercial units are going to have a beam divergence between 0.8 of a mil and 2 mils. 1.5 mils is pretty common. Now, to put that in perspective, okay, 1 mil at 300 yards is like 12 inches of linear space. And so if we double that, 1 mil at 600, well, now it's 2 feet, right? So it goes from being a foot to being 2 feet. And then at 1,000, well, let's double it again, right? 600, 1,200, well, now we're talking 48 inches, okay? And so if you've got your beam divergence that's like this at 1,000 yards, and you've got a target that you're trying to hit that's only like 8 inches or something, that's going to be a tough situation for that rangefinder. And then two, the strength of the laser and the configuration of the units. I mean, there's a vast disparity when we go from the production stuff. And, there's another rangefinder that I have, a Swarovski EL range rangefinder. It's a set of binoculars as well. It's like $3,000 plus, $3,400. And there's not a huge difference between the Vortex and that Swarovski in terms of its raw ranging capability. The primary difference between them is the glass quality. Obviously, the Swarovski is of a higher pedigree and much nicer to look through than the Vortex. But the Vortex is an extremely capable unit when it comes to its range-finding capability as it pertains to commercially available, readily available units that people can go out and buy. So the differences between them are almost zero in terms of their range-finding capability. And frankly, all of the competitively priced, and I mean sub $4,000 range-finding units that you can go buy are in the same category in terms of their capabilities. Now, until I got a rangefinder that was significantly better, Vectronics, obviously, their original Terrapin was the first time that I actually experienced what a real good rangefinder behaved like. And the original Terrapin, I'm not talking about the new Terrapin X, okay? The new Terrapin X is no better, in my opinion, than the Swarovski EL range or the Vortex Fury HD in terms of its raw ranging capabilities. Obviously, it has some other benefits, and I'm not saying that it's a bad unit, but I'm saying that it suffers from very much the same kinds of problems that the commercially available rangefinders have. And so regardless of the make and model, the name brand, it really makes no difference. The model, it really makes no difference. If it is beneath, say, $5,000, you're going to be getting the same type of capability virtually out of almost all of these units. Now, there's going to be some small pluses and minuses. But as we've seen, folks, these things stop working effectively at 600 to 800 yards. And that's on relatively large sized targets. I'm talking something like a deer, right? Realistically, I would only trust in every condition, in just about every situation, I would trust them for a shot on a big game animal out to maybe 600 yards. Because the error that I might get off of it at 600, I think it would still keep a guy on the animal in terms of being able to hit your big game animal and get a kill. In terms of competition and shooting at small targets, let's say a 1 MOA sized target, which is in most field disciplines is a relatively sporty target at a lot of these events. I would not trust them on a 1 MOA target past about 500 yards. And I would consider myself lucky if I was able to get them to range back correctly past that distance. Now that is a very condemning statement to the industry of laser rangefinders and the state of that industry right now. We are saddled with some extremely inferior equipment, and there's not really an option out of it other than to buy big. Now the Vectronics rangefinders are where this stops, and there's a couple other companies out there that produce similar rangefinding capability, but there's always the question of legitimacy. There's always the question of whether or not you're going to get support. The support is terrible for these higher end units because they're aimed directly at the military. So if getting the precise range to target wasn't so important for me, I don't think that I would ever entertain purchasing one of these things. But if you're shooting small targets, which I am, if they're distant targets, which they are, then you don't have a choice, because as you see in the presentation, if I'm off on my range by even 10 yards, then it's going to create an error in my firing solution that is irreconcilable. I won't be able to overcome that in any way. And that's why it's so important to have the correct range to target. Now, when guys come shoot with me and they get an opportunity to use their ranging equipment, and I compare the ranges that they're getting out of their equipment to my Vectronics Vector 23, which has a beam divergence of like 0.3 of a mil. I mean, it's extremely tight. Then they realize just how much this laser rangefinder error has been affecting their shooting and affecting their shots over time. So let's take a look at a firing solution from a 6mm dasher with a 105 grain Berger hybrid doing 2,925 foot per second. And let's put in the actual range to that target. We've got 3.5 mils of elevation and 1.1 mil of wind. So let's go to 644 yards. Now look, we've got 3.8 and 1.2, so we've got a 1/10 mil wind error, and we have a 0.3 of a mil error on elevation. That is extreme. That's a big, big problem. When you have a firing solution that has both a windage and an elevation error, the actual practical effect on accuracy is significantly worse than it looks. Let's have a look at a basic fact here. 1/10 of a mil at 500 yards is roughly 1.8 linear inches. So if we were at 500 yards, this is what a 1/10 of a mil would look like, 1.8 inches. Now, if you look suspended in space out here is a little dot, that's the same distance. And it might not look it because there's no line connecting it, but it is 1.8 inches from here and 1.8 inches from here. So, when we're considering firing solution error at distance, we have to understand something, and that is just because our firing solution is off by a 1/10 of a mil doesn't mean that that's the totality of our actual error. We are working in grids when it comes to the adjustment of our scope or our holds, but we shoot angularly, and we oftentimes will think of shooting in terms of a circle. So let's have a look here of what a circle. This is 1.8 inches from here to here. And I'll turn on a little guide just to let you guys see that. So 1.8 inches across. So this circle represents 1/10 of a mil. Now, 1/10 of a mil at 100 yards is 0.36 inches. So that third MOA, roughly, right? Third MOA, that third MOA stretched out to 500 yards is going to look about like this. And so it's really puts things in perspective here when we're talking about 1/10 of a mil of adjustment and what it does to our intended shot cone. Because if we consider for a minute that our exact center of our firing solution puts us here, and if we had 1/10 of a mil of elevation error and 1/10 of a mil of windage error in our firing solution as a result of either a computational error or a error in our laser rangefinder, it could put us here. So we would dial our scope for this instead of this. Now, look at what happens when we overlay that 1/10 of a mil error. Just because we're dialing 1/10 and we've got 1/10 of wind doesn't mean that that's exactly what's taking place in terms of our total error. So look at the difference when we look at this from a perspective of a shot cone or circle. So for our rifles holding third MOA, and we're able to consistently hold a third MOA, and let's just say for the sake of argument we're able to execute shots perfectly, this interior circle represents our standard shot cone at 500 yards. Now, when we introduce the error, this is the actual distance. Instead of 1.8 inches, now we're over here. If we were to place this circle over here, they would not overlap. Now, look at the difference in what we would hit if our target was only, say, 1 MOA in size, which would be basically 3 times larger than what we see here. I mean, this starts to become a real problem. Now, we're just going to take, for example, everybody always knows that trying to shoot diamonds is harder than shooting circles. And that's a comment that I hear all the time. Well, that's because when you're shooting a diamond, you get no benefit for anything that goes up here. If we overlay our intended shot cone based on 1/10 of a mil of variance in our firing solution, we go from having a certainty of a hit to reducing that chance exponentially. Now, this can be evidenced by just taking a target of a known size and overlaying it. Just take a look here. We'll put little Mr. Prairie Dog head, and I mean, this is pretty true to scale. This is about how big they are, okay? So 1.8 inches, typically speaking, a couple inches is how much you've got room to work with. So on one hand, if we were able to produce this shot right here, we've got roughly 100% chance of hitting it. But if we had 1/10 of a mil of aiming error as a function of a miscalculation, look what that does. All of a sudden, we're over here, and we have no chance of hitting this target. Now, if we take our little Mr. Prairie Dog here, and we put his body up here, and we're aiming what would be center mass essentially at the largest portion of him, all of a sudden now you see, well, wow, we can make 1/10 of a mil and still have roughly a 50% chance of hitting this prairie dog. So this is a huge thing, folks, because it outlines that if we're not thinking about scale correctly, then our chances of hitting our intended target goes down dramatically. Now, you can get Vectronics. There's a couple of units that you can get. The PLRF 25 And I think they're up to D or E or something like that in the model designation, but the PLRF 25 is an extremely capable unit. You can get older PLRF 10s and 15s. Now there's no support for them anymore, so you're literally just rolling the dice on whether or not you're going to be able to keep that unit functioning for a long period of time. But when there's no support, there's no support. That means you can't even pay them to fix it if it breaks. Now, conversely, the vectors, they're still offering support for a large number of the vector products. They've got the new higher end stuff, the mosquitoes and various other things. But folks, this is all crazy expensive stuff. I think the cheapest you can get a PLRF 25 is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like $9,000. And so this is not an easy problem to solve, but your awareness of it now, here's the solution, right? You either money your way into the solution here, or you practice with your laser rangefinder in so many different situations that you get to know where you can trust it. And you use land effects, right? So you know that if the target is here and you've got terrain behind the target, well, you try to range the target and then you pull off to the side and range just the background right next to the target. And if it reads out the same, well, you know that you got a problem and you need to try to ping that target again. And so what you do is called bracketing. You ping the target, you ping something right at the base of the target. So if it's a deer standing there or a suspended target, you'd ping the target, then you'd ping the ground right beneath the target. So you try to get a range right at its feet, so to speak. Then you can ping the right or left side to see, okay, am I actually getting the target or am I getting something that's behind the target? And so if you ping off to the right or left side, you should be getting something behind. The actual target should be significantly closer, unless there's, a vertical wall right behind your target, which in some cases maybe there will be. So you use the terrain and your knowledge of what the rangefinder is capable of to overcome its deficiencies. And by bracketing and running the rangefinder on the plus or minus side, ranging things between you and the target, using your own mind and saying, well, range estimation, right? Thinking to yourself, is that right? I think he's closer than that. And so you have to decide whether or not you're going to believe what your rangefinder is telling you. And if you decide that you're not going to believe it, well, then how are you going to determine the range? So you'd have to pick and choose of the presentation that you have on the target, what you're going to range, how you're going to range it, how you're going to determine exactly to the closest number possible the actual range to that target. So this is just a couple of methods that you can use to try to overcome the deficiencies of rangefinders that are behaving that way. Now, don't get me wrong, I still use the same techniques with the Vector 23, but at a significantly farther range. Real life capability, that thing will range a deer standing at like 5,000 yards, suspended. Like I've seen them on the top of buttes, and I can range the deer at over 5,000 yards. So farther than I would ever think to engage one, and of course ranging a deer inside of 1,200 yards is just a joke for that thing. So they do have value, and if any of you are a student of the discipline members and you come here to train, obviously you can bring your rangefinder with you. We will help you corral your own rangefinder's capabilities and help you get more familiar with how to overcome its limitations. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little piece of members-only exclusive content. Now, you have to be an apprentice-level member or a student of the discipline-level member in order to watch this video. If you are watching this and you are a member and you enjoyed this content, I would encourage you to please try to refer some people to come over and join and become members themselves. Really, folks, I'm relying solely on your guys' referrals and word-of-mouth testimonials as to the value of instruction that we're going to be providing here on this channel. So I really appreciate your viewership, so much so that I'm going to be dedicating this entire year to delivering this kind of content. Now, we're going to have a lot more detailed stuff coming in the subsequent months, but this is just the first one. I thought it was great to talk about because this rangefinder error has been creeping up in my conversations with people a lot. When you start questioning why you're missing things, and when I've given you the ability to self-diagnose, and you know it wasn't you, but you still missed, and you don't think it was you on the load bench and you still missed, well, this rangefinder error could be a large portion of the blame. So, but again, I thank you for your viewership, and I'm going to be spending time for you guys this year. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time talking on forums, at least not for this year. I mean, we'll check it out again in a year's time or something like that. But frankly, folks, I'm just tired of wasting my time. People mistake the content that I put out on forums and the things that I say there and the guides that I release. They think that I'm looking for a discussion, and I'm not. Folks, I'm an instructor. The things that I'm instructing on do not require a discussion. They require thought. They don't require an immediate reaction and dismissal. I'd encourage you guys to think diligently about what you hear me say or things that you see me do, because it's not just surface level deep stuff. There's a reason behind everything that I'm saying, and I've thought about it more than just a little bit. And so I would ask that same grace from you guys to understand that there's a lot to this, and there's a lot to being able to instruct properly to make sure that you're picking up the concepts effectively. And I just don't see that kind of thing happening on a forum anymore. There's just too much clutter, there's too much noise, there's too much argument, and that's why I started this paid membership portion of our YouTube channel, because that would give me something to focus on where you guys have paid to be here, and I am massively appreciative at the fact that you're willing to do that. And so I'm not going to let you down. This is the passion of my life. It is what I love to do, and I'm going to provide that in the highest level possible for you guys. You know, remember, if you're an apprentice level or student of the discipline level, you have access to me. You can call me. If there's any questions that you have about this, if there's any ideas that you have or you want to discuss, you guys, I'm willing to have discussions with, right? Because you've already demonstrated that you want to be here. You've demonstrated that you want to improve, and you're willing to sacrifice something in order to get that improvement. So don't be shy. You are my focus for this whole year. Now, this may continue, and I might just do this every year from here on. But you guys are my focus. And so that means, please take advantage of the resource. Call me if you'd like. If you have any questions, you can call me. And we will go over this stuff in as much or as little detail as you want. The goal here is to see you become significantly greater shooters than you are now. And I fully intend on using all of my talents and resources to help you to that end.